Do we have just one earthly life, or do we return time and time again? Even in the last 25 years, an increasing number in the Western world have come around to the view that this is not our only life. For millennia, mystics, artists, and scientists, and some of the greatest thinkers have all accepted reincarnation as a central tenet of human existence. Just the other month, I was doing a Google search on my phone, and I typed in the words who, B-E-L. And before I even entered the full word believe, I received the following possibilities. Number one, reincarnation. Number two, God. Number three, purgatory. Number four, karma. And number five, something called Bell's Dad, Love Island. Well, imagine for what was till recently a topical program as Love Island pushed to number five in the popularity stakes of belief or interest. Indeed, a survey in 1959 indicated that about 12% of people in Britain believed in reincarnation. 20 years later, the figure had doubled to 24% in the concept of rebirth. But what it does not tell you is how many did not believe and how many did not know either way. The figure by the year 2000 probably had reached 50% of the British population. And the number who did not believe could be 25% or less, with the balance undecided. This is nothing short of remarkable for what is on the surface a Western nation. In the Orient, the belief has been in the majority, though, for a very long time. If, as some suggest, that justice rules the universe, rebirth is the only logical explanation for dealing with apparent inequalities and squaring why some are wealthy and others are poor, while others have good health, and yet others are dealt a rotten set of health cards. I like to say that I hardly know myself, and everyone else is a complete stranger, at least as far as really knowing what is going on in their lives, rather than the surface appearances most of us see most of the time. Those who have financial wealth may not always have had it. Earlier in this life or in previous lives, they may have been in the poorhouse. And through their efforts and possible ingenuity, they may have improved their lot materially beyond all imagination. 25 years ago, most of the major technology companies which dominate our lives today did not exist. And in a very short time, several people have made fortunes that would have seemed impossible even 10 years ago. Of course, as we have seen with some of those who win vast sums on the lottery, sudden wealth does not guarantee happiness, and in fact can tear apart families and relationships. Also, material success is certainly no guarantee of good health. And in fact, the consequences of too much good living, rich food, excessive alcohol, etc., can actually lead to poor health, if not watched and balanced by an appropriate amount of exercise and discretion. My own wife was plagued by poor health almost from day one of our 18-year marriage. If I had been a bit more perceptive to the severity of my wife's vitality, I might have worked a little less hard to save for our old age, as my wife Alana died well short of retirement at just 57 years of age. I know a prominent member of the TS in Wales said that she has now worked through her health karma and will not have to carry a burden of poor health in future lives. One could say that the permanent atom, her higher self, decided previously that in this incarnation, my wife would face restrictions brought on by a less than vital body. We don't simply return to this plane of existence for the sake of returning, like going on an endless holiday. So while many have said the purpose of life is for living, that can appear to be a bit trite. The remark needs a bit more flesh on it, as it were, to have any value. Rebirth makes little sense without being linked to karma, the law of cause and effect. Whereas some religious thought looks on rebirth as punishment, others see it as a reward. Terms like good and bad are relative and do not really tell us much of use. The return of the reincarnating ego into flesh happens when the time is right. Highly evolved souls like adepts have no need to return for thousands of years. Conversely, those who hold a purely material outlook and do not really contribute any selfless acts in this life may return in just a few hundred years or even less. And those who died in childbirth or youth or are killed in an accident or a theater of war while young may return in just a few years. One of the members of the South Essex Theosophical Center who recently died, again, is convinced he was a Luftwaffe bomber in the early years of World War II. While the war was still waging, he reincarnated in 1944. He had several visions of this episode being regularly repeated. And in his 70s, he was still suffering severe depression as a result. A word of warning to those who wish to know of their previous lives. They should think very carefully what they wish. We are impelled back into flesh after going through two main after-death states, Kamaloka and Devachan. These episodes, which are purely subjective, give us a chance to review the previous life and then enjoy the fruits of our good efforts in a bliss-like state, a sort of heaven, if you wish. And here's one view of heaven as seen by Dante. And another one from Bangkok, from the Buddhists. Only the selfless bits of our nature are assimilated into the upper triad, Atma, Buddhi, Manas, which form our individuality, the permanent part of us, as compared to the lower quaternary, our physical senses and lower mind. There are countless lessons for each of us to learn on the road to self-realization. As the expression would have it, Rome was not made in a day, and perfection will take many, possibly thousands of lives before we attain the peak of our spiritual Mount Everest. Mozart worked at his profession over many lives to achieve his mastery. The same is true for others at the top of their game, whether it be in sports, the arts, science, or philosophy. There is the view that we return in waves with others we have known in previous lives. No doubt many, if not all of you present at this talk, have felt a certain déjà vu experience when at certain places where you have lived before or encountering certain persons for the first time in this lifetime. The experience you have with some will be pleasant, with others it will be a bit more challenging. But on the path of unfoldment, you will find your adversary a better teacher of the lessons required in this life than your so-called friends. What most irritates you in others may well be something in your own character that still needs resolving. The whole world is based on relationships of one sort or another, whether in the workplace, at home, or in the community at large. And while in a previous life you had just a passing acquaintance with the milkman, for example, others may well have been of a far closer link, such as a spouse or sibling. And if there was unfinished business, karma will bring you back to balance the books, as it were. My wife studied astrology, as well as a host of other disciplines like French, numerology, and theosophy. She did remark once that, astrologically speaking, ours was not an easy relationship, but with effort could be made to work. I certainly hope that in a future incarnation, I again will meet the soul which was called Alana in this life, and that she again is my wife and not the milkman. The fact that my career ended up in London working for the Theosophical Society was hardly what my personality had imagined in 1977 when I set out for these shores after parting company with my radio station employer in a two-horse town in the wilds of British Columbia, Canada. Reincarnation, also called rebirth, is part of the samsara doctrine of cyclic existence in the Orient. It's a central tenet of Indian religions, namely Jainism, Buddhism, Sikhism, and Hinduism. Belief in reincarnation or metempsychosis, i.e. transmigration of the soul, was also held by Greek historic figures such as Pythagoras, Socrates, and Plato. It's a commonly held view of various ancient and modern philosophical systems, Spiritism, Ekankar, and of course, Theosophy. Additionally, it's a common belief and is found in some beliefs of First Nation and indigenous peoples in North America. While not officially part of Christianity or Islam anymore, reincarnation is held to be true by historical and contemporary followers of Cathars, Alawites, the Druze, and Rosicrucians. The latter of whom were Theosophists in the Middle Ages. And there we have some imagery of the Kabbalah, a Latin translation, which appears in Tel Aviv in a museum. The historical relations between these sects and the beliefs about reincarnation that were characteristic of Neoplatonism, Orphism, Hermeticism, Manichaeism, and Gnosticism of the Roman era, as well as the Indian religions, have been the subject of recent scholarly research. And Unity Church, headquartered in Kansas City, Missouri, teaches reincarnation from the pulpit. A number of high-profile personalities that were warm to the concept of reincarnation include Henry Ford, who built the first mass-produced automobile in 1896. He said that as a young man, he found himself asking the question, what are we here for? And he said that without an answer, life seemed useless. Once coming into possession of a book on reincarnation, his outlook changed dramatically. He said, it changed my life to have purpose and meaning. And he realized that he, or rather his soul, was immortal. Lloyd George, the British Prime Minister during the darkest days of World War I, remarked, my opinion is that we will be reincarnated and shall suffer or benefit in accordance with what we have done in this world. The employer who sweats his work people will be condemned to be sweated himself in lives to come. Poets have always been regarded as sages and been divinely inspired. A few of these who had the reincarnation belief were Goethe, Whitman, Tennyson, Wordsworth, and Masefield. The English poet John Masefield believed that the thrust for life is not expunged at the moment of death. He writes in Sea Fever, I hold that when a person dies, his soul returns again to earth, arrayed in some new flesh disguise. Another mother gives him birth. With sturdier limbs and brighter brain, the old soul takes the road again. Other famous people who believe or have believed in reincarnation include Napoleon Bonaparte, who conquered much of Europe during the 19th century. He regarded himself as the reincarnation of Charlemagne and believed he was destined to rule over the Roman Empire, which led him to adopt the Roman eagle as his symbol. General George Patton was America's greatest combat general of World War II. A firm believer in reincarnation, in a previous life, he thought he'd been the Carthaginian general Hannibal. American actor Sylvester Stallone, famous for his Rocky films, believes he once was a boxer who was killed by a knockout blow in the 1930s. He also remembers a previous life quite literally losing his head during the French Revolution. Phil Collins, lead singer in the rock band Genesis, has the largest private collection of artifacts relating to the siege of the Alamo in Texas in 1836. And he believes he was one of the soldiers trying to defend the American garrison. Shirley Maclaine, the American film, television, and theater actress, firmly believes in reincarnation and past lives, and allegedly can even trace an earlier existence in Lemuria. She has written a number of books on metaphysics, spirituality, and reincarnation, including a best-selling memoir, Out on a Limb, in 1983. And of course, there are any number of people who claim to have been Cleopatra in ancient times. Interestingly, precious few admit to having been her handmaiden or the asp. While the worldview of the Theosophical Society is not set in concrete, detailed memories of past lives, except for the accounts of young children mentioned in Dr. Ian Stevenson's studies, in the main can be discounted. As H.P. Blavatsky states in the Key to Theosophy, since those principles, which we call physical, are disintegrated after death with their constituent elements, the vanished memory of a vanished personality can neither remember nor record anything in the subsequent reincarnation of the ego. The reincarnating body is furnished with a new body, new brain, and new memory. The ego alone is permanent throughout the cycle of lives. Knowledge of past lives is attainable only by putting oneself in a rapport with that ego. Among the cities or powers of the self, developed naturally or through discipline, is the ability to recall past lives. Gautama the Buddha tells how, after enlightenment, he was the line of all his lives in all the worlds. For the adept, therefore, reincarnation is not a matter of belief, but of knowledge. Ian Stevenson, as a founder of the University of Virginia's Division of Perceptual Studies, which investigates the paranormal, became known internationally for his research into reincarnation, with the idea that emotions, memories, and even physical bodily features can be transferred from one life to another. He traveled extensively over 40 years, investigating 3,000 cases of children around the world, many in India, who claimed to remember past lives. His position was that phobias, philias, or loves, unusual abilities, and illnesses could not be fully explained by heredity or the environment. He believed that reincarnation provided a third type of explanation. Stevenson hoped to found the Society for Scientific Exploration in 1982. He was author of around 300 papers and 14 books on reincarnation, including 20 cases suggestive of reincarnation in 1966 and European cases of the reincarnation type in the year 2003. His major work was the 2,268-page, two-volume Reincarnation and Biology, a contribution to the etiology of birthmarks and birth defects, written in 1997. This reported 200 cases of birthmarks and birth defects that seemed to correspond to a wound on the deceased person whose life the child recalled. My own journey of spirituality started to move around the age of 14 or 15. We used to visit my father's parents for a Sunday roast in Vancouver, perhaps once a month. The conversation must have been particularly boring for a teenager on one particular occasion, as my eyes wandered towards a small bookcase across the room from my seat in the living room. And as I crossed the floor, my gaze was drawn towards a slim paperback entitled Strange Powers of Unusual People. It was all about the sleeping prophet, Edgar Cayce. Cayce was an especially gifted clairvoyant, and people whose cases defied explanation by conventional health professionals would go to Cayce, who would go into a trance where he would be able to see the underlying causes of their disease and prescribe an appropriate cure. The messages he related in trance were all transcribed by his secretary. In many cases, he would remark that a patient's previous life, he could see the cause of their ailment. Now, the first time he heard these accounts from his secretary, he retorted that as a Christian in his waking state, he did not believe in reincarnation. But from that point on, he changed his tone and opinion. I avidly poured through this book on Cayce, which I devoured in a single reading one long night. Such topics as telepathy and chakras were covered between the pages, but it was the R word, reincarnation, that pressed my buttons big time. Oh yes, I said, I believe in that. An idealistic teenager with a mission to change the world, I felt I must tell everyone of this new discovery of mine. My mother, though, was a little less enthusiastic and remarked that not everyone would thank me for telling them about this earth-shattering discovery. A new chapter in my life had begun. A new door had been opened into the mysteries of existence. A few years later, there was another progressive development. At the age of 17, I had tired of the bullying I'd been subject to at my local school and applied to decamp to another school district where conveniently my father worked. At my new school, I encountered children interested in psychic matters. We used to practice telepathy using playing cards. And then our investigations progressed, or on reflection, regressed to trying to channel entities through the Ouija board. We experienced one particularly frightening episode, news of which reached the mother of one of the girls in the group. The mother in question didn't panic and was encouraged that we had had inquiring minds, but felt that we would benefit from meeting a certain woman who might answer some of our questions on the subject. So a few of us got together one evening in 1969, visiting an old office building in the center of Vancouver to attend a meeting. The lady hosting the meeting was Hannah Buchanan, a dour Scot, and the meeting was hosted by the Theosophical Society. The subject matter was the secret doctrine, and while most of us felt overwhelmed by the array of subjects surveyed, all I can recall is that I was hooked and wished to join on the spot. I would have to wait a few months later to reach 18, but joined at a ceremony in November of that year. So later in 2019, I celebrated 50 years as a member of the TS, first in Canada until 1981, and then transferring to the English section from 1982. Yet another door had opened for me. From a very early age, I had a desire to work in the media, originally as a play-by-play sports announcer, perhaps in ice hockey, my favorite spectator sport. And in the early 1970s, I undertook a 2-year course at the British Columbia Institute of Technology and graduated with a diploma in broadcast communications, specializing in radio. Eventually, I bagged a job in the interior of the province, doing a bit of everything, writing advertisements and disc jockeying, but in the main, reporting and reading the news. After 18 months, I moved from a one-horse town to a horse town, but never really fit in. I had borrowed a book from a local library with the title Africa, the Continent, which started in my mind dreaming of the road. Why talk about Addis Ababa? Why not go there? Well, I have not yet seen Ethiopia, but I have visited a number of North African countries, including Egypt. The upshot of this was I tossed in the towel, or rather, when I requested a leave of absence, my employer went one step further and said, after my long distance trip, I didn't need to return to my job. Another door had closed and a new one was about to open. So in May 1977, I boarded the first of 4 trains across North America en route to JFK Airport in New York. And after a short stopover in Iceland, I landed at Paisley Airport in Scotland. And over the following 2 months, I hitchhiked over much of Scotland and even sold a story to the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation in Toronto on the fight for the Gaelic tongue. Eventually, I landed in London, where I penned a few more short radio reports covering such topics as 3-wheel cars and British nutrition, ? The Home Office had granted me a 6-month visa, and as I was not selling enough stories to eat, I needed to find some other income stream. And eventually I found myself working as a market research interviewer. And this I did for some 23 years, even working alongside my day job at the Theosophical Society in London. Another door had opened. While in London, I would attend wherever possible meetings of the TS at its central London headquarters. And on the 7th of July, 1981, I was to attend a lecture entitled What is Death? By the celebrated American speaker and leader, Joy Mills. As I was about to go through the front door, a chap called Tony was coming out. He greeted me with the question, "Can you type?" When I replied, "Yes," he said, "Well, you'll probably be successful. You see, there's a job vacancy for publicity officer, and they need someone who can type." I spoke to the then General Secretary, Marion Cause, about the job, and she inquired as to whether I was planning to attend the 1981 summer school at Highley Hoddesdon Hearts. When I replied in the affirmative, she said, "Well, we'll discuss the position when you see they're there, when we see you there." And when I next saw her at the school a month later, after just 5 minutes, she inquired as to, "When would you like to begin?" And on the 7th of September, I began what was to become my life's main occupation. Another door opens. Well, I've always been a firm believer that while we have free will, i.e., we are not just puppets on a string, the actual amount of choice is probably much less than generally thought. My higher self probably decided long ago that I might leave my country at birth, and that I would spend my life in the field of communications in one way or another, and that spirituality would be at the cornerstone of my interests. And even the significant relationships in my life. And was it merely chance, or was I fated to meet my future wife? Perhaps I shall never know for sure. Now, as for evidence, there's a considerable body that's been assembled in anthologies and published accounts of scientific investigation into reincarnation. The anthologies show the antiquity and universality of the doctrine of the plurality of lives and the intellectual stature of its exponents. The accumulation of case studies in which reincarnation offers the best explanation, especially those by Dr. Ian Stevenson, although not constituting proof, lend substantial support to the ancient teaching. Annie Besant, in a work called Reincarnation, sets out this explanatory statement. The theory of reincarnation in the esoteric philosophy asserts the existence of living and individualized principle, which dwells in and informs the body of man, and which, in the death of the body, passes into another body after a longer or shorter interval. Thus, successive bodily lives are linked together like pearls strung on a thread, the thread being the living principle, the pearls upon it, the separate human lives. The great psychologist Carl Jung became open to the idea of some sort of afterlife after experiencing clinical death in 1944. A scientist of international repute, his testimony must be accepted as not only unquestionable, but as being immaculate in its testimony, because he was a trained scientific observer of the most abstruse matters. Jung's description of the out-of-body state is highly relevant because the inquirer will want many questions answered before he is convinced of there being a credible basis for reincarnation. Jung's work on himself and his patients convinced him that life has a spiritual purpose, and that our main task is to discover and then fulfill our deep innate potential. Based on his study of Christianity, Hinduism, Buddhism, Gnosticism, Taoism, and other traditions, Jung believed that this journey of transformation, which he called individuation, is at the mystical heart of all religions. It is a journey to meet the self, and at the same time to meet the divine. Now, a popular misconception surrounding the whole subject of reincarnation is the rebirth of human beings into animal forms. This is the doctrine of transmigration of souls. The ancient Egyptians, in their Book of the Dead, cultivated this belief as a penalty for living a wicked life, whereas the virtuous continued in human form. This is not, I must stress, the worldview espoused by the Theosophical Society. The TS does not refute the findings of Charles Darwin in his Origin of Species, but rather the society feels he didn't go far enough, as he does not discuss spiritual evolution. And did you know there's actually an organization in the US of A that believes that we will return in the next life exactly as we were in this incarnation, wearing the same clothes, in the same town, having the same job, the same friends, and the same conversations? Well, for a start, this would be a reincarnation of the personality, definitely not part of the theosophical worldview. In this case, there is no progress in such a viewpoint. To summarize, reincarnation is a concept which, in the East, is probably accepted by the majority of its citizens, and quickly reaching that situation in the West, certainly in the Anglo-Saxon countries, or those with a large Asian minority. As more and more people embrace the concept of unity, and not just amongst people of all lands, but with a reverence for our fur-legged friends and Mother Nature, the idea of rebirth is starting to make sense to a lot more people. Living once and assuming that life is a lottery is hardly logical or fair. To think that by chance or roll of the dice, one is born in good health or bad, and with or without the basic necessities of food, shelter, and a stable home life hardly makes sense. My heart, and yours no doubt as well, goes out to our Ukrainian friends, many of whose lives have been cut short or who have lost virtually everything because of incessant bombing of their cities and homes. And those of us listening to this talk should thank our lucky stars that we have avoided such a conflict, at least so far. My wife had an interesting take on the situation of those who die in a theater of war. Namely, that in a previous life, they signed up to make this sacrifice. And depending on their age and circumstances, they may reincarnate quickly, as will those killed as used suddenly in car accidents or other tragedies. I do believe that justice does rule the universe, but verification of this can only be seen to be at work by those who have the ability to view previous lives of the individual in question. What we have done today and all the days of this life will determine the sort of existence we will inherit in a future incarnation. As that expression in the Christian Bible describes it, as you sow, so shall you reap. This is also repeated in an expression that is popular in the north of England, namely, what goes around comes around. These remarks refer to karma, the law of cause and effect, which works hand in glove with reincarnation as a basic linchpin of the esoteric philosophy. Coming back time and again, simply for the pleasure of life, is a no-gainer or no-brainer. That's not to say that we shouldn't enjoy this existence, even if much of it, as my girlfriend regularly reminds me, is an illusion, what in the Orient is referred to as Maya. But as always, there is the advice to not put all your eggs in one basket, to be thankful when abundance knocks at our door, but don't be too despondent when times are tough, managing to maintain a sense of proportion, as it were. But the name of the game is to recognize life for what it is, that of endless opportunities to reduce bad karma and gain good karma. The way to do this is quite simple in principle, but I have to admit, difficult in practice. The Buddhists and Christians have a lot more in common than perhaps many of their leaders or even their followers might think. The Buddhists tell us that we should practice selfless acts, i.e., to live for others. Christian theology often extols the virtue of a life of service. At gut level, I see very little difference in these two philosophies. Definitely, these are ideas on which we should all meditate and put into practice as seems appropriate. Helena Petrovna Blavatsky, the great co-founder of the Theosophical Society in 1875, produced a detailed diagram of meditation that she put forward for all aspirants to the sacred science of theosophy to study and practice. Many find her writings either too obscure or obtuse, but this diagram flies in the face of such sentiments and sets out a way to lose the little self and march towards emerging with the greater self and greater reality beyond this world. She begins with the injunction, first conceive of unity by expansion in space and infinite in time. We are then told to meditate logically and consistently on this in reference to states of consciousness. I read somewhere that Blavatsky suggested that for every hour we read something of spiritual uplift, we should meditate on the subject for 10 hours. Obviously, she was a huge fan of meditation, whereby one could enter the portal to inner realms. Absolutely fundamental to the society's vision of a new continent of thought is its positively revolutionary first object, where unity is the watchword. That is, to form a nucleus of the universal brotherhood of mankind, without distinction of race, creed, sex, caste, or color. Even though on many occasions Blavatsky states that unity is a fact of nature, we are obviously a long way off realizing it in a practical way. This utopian state of affairs, and many more lifetimes, will have to be endured by huge swaths of humanity before unity becomes a fact of daily life on planet Earth. The main hindrance to our growth and development seems to be ignorance of our essential nature. What is our real self? And taking to heart the real challenge of putting altruism and brotherhood at the center of all of our actions. We close with some wise words by Blavatsky on the subject at hand, taken from the Collected Writings 12, page 302. We believe human body to be but the shell, cover or veil of the real entity. Yet, though it may clothe and reclothe itself 1,000 times in a series of reincarnations, the entity is unchanged and unchangeable, being of a divine nature, superior to all environments on the earthly plane. It is only the physical body which has racial type, color, sex, hatreds, ambitions, and loves. If this view of kinship of all mankind could gain universal acceptance, the improved sense of moral responsibility it would engender would cause most social evils and international asperities to disappear. For a true altruism instead of the present egoism would be the rule, would rule the world over. And I would just like to close with one of Blavatsky's greatest pieces of work, The Golden Stairs. A clean life, an open mind, a pure heart, an eager intellect, an unveiled spiritual perception, a brotherliness for all, a readiness to give and receive advice and instruction, a courageous endurance of personal injustice, a brave declaration of principles, a valiant defense of those who are unjustly attacked, a constant eye to the ideal of human progression and perfection, which the sacred science depicts. These are the golden stairs, up the steps of which the learner must climb to the temple of divine wisdom. Thank you for your attention.